William Carter stepped out of the VIP examination room at St. Vincent's Hospital. He was about to leave when a small child suddenly ran from the opposite direction and bumped into him. The little boy fell to the ground but didn't cry. Instead, he pressed his lips together and tried to push himself up. William reached down to help him, but then he froze. His gaze locked onto the boy's eyes. They were too familiar. It was as if he was looking at a younger version of his own son, Matthew Carter. For a brief moment, an indescribable feeling spread through his chest. The trembling of the child's small hands, the background noise of the hospital, all of it faded. All he could see were those eyes. William hesitated before letting go of the boy's hand. A woman approached, taking the child's hand. He smiled brightly at her and ran to her side. As the boy turned away, William instinctively reached out, gently brushing the boy's hair in a seemingly affectionate gesture, pulling a single strand of hair between his fingers. No one noticed the small action, but this was the moment that would reveal a hidden truth. A truth that, once uncovered, would shake William Carter's entire world. As soon as William left the hospital, he immediately called his assistant. "Send this hair sample for a DNA test. I need the results as soon as possible." His assistant, well trained to follow orders without question, simply responded, "Yes, sir." William closed his phone and fell into deep thought. Could this boy really be his blood? Despite his rational mind telling him to wait for confirmation, an uneasy feeling had already begun creeping into his chest. 2 days later, his assistant handed him a sealed envelope. William took the file and opened it without hesitation. Probability of biological relationship, 99.9%. His hand trembled slightly. This child was his grandson. The moment the certainty settled in, his thoughts raced. Why was he only finding out now? Did Matthew even know? And who was this boy's mother? Had she deliberately hidden the truth? William closed his eyes for a brief second before reopening them. He had to uncover everything himself. "Find out everything about a woman named Emily Brooks," he ordered his assistant, his voice firm. Without hesitation, his assistant nodded and left the room. William turned toward the large window of his office, staring out at the city skyline. His world was now shifting in ways he could no longer control. 2 days later, his assistant returned with a neatly compiled report on Emily Brooks. William sat at his desk, flipping through the file. Emily Brooks, 28 years old, junior designer at Carter Enterprises. Single mother to a 5-year-old son. No record of the father. His jaw tightened. No information about the father? Was that an oversight? Or had she deliberately kept it hidden? As he flipped through the pages, a particular photo made him pause. Emily was holding the child in her arms, smiling gently. But William wasn't looking at her. His focus was entirely on the boy. The bright smile, the slight tilt of his head. It was like seeing Matthew's childhood all over again. He inhaled deeply. This wasn't something he could figure out through reports alone. He had to meet her in person. Call Emily Brooks and bring her in, immediately. His assistant left to carry out the order. William closed the file and sat back in his chair. Why had this woman been raising his grandson alone? Meanwhile, Emily sat at her desk, staring at the email she had just received. She was an ordinary employee, working quietly in the design department. Why on earth was the company's founder and chairman emeritus requesting to meet her personally? A nervous feeling settled in her stomach as she stood up and headed for his office. Emily stepped into William Carter's office cautiously. He was already waiting. Without a greeting or introduction, he simply pushed a document toward her across the desk. A DNA test. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask what it was about. The answer was clear. Her fingers clenched around the edge of her skirt as she stared at the paper in front of her. Shock, confusion, fear. William's voice cut through the silence, calm but commanding. "Is Ethan Carter my grandson?" The moment of truth had arrived. Emily's hands trembled slightly. The DNA test was right in front of her. The truth had already been revealed, yet hearing the words from William Carter made it even more real. She swallowed hard. There was no more room to run. "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent office it echoed like a thunderclap. William didn't react immediately. His expression was unreadable, his sharp gaze never leaving her. "Then let me ask you this," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "If Ethan is my grandson, why didn't you tell my son?" Emily lowered her head. "Because I didn't know who his father was." A flicker of surprise crossed William's face. "You didn't know?" She clasped her hands together tightly, her voice trembling. 5 years ago. I got pregnant, but I had no idea who the father was. I didn't remember his name or even his face." Silence filled the room. For the first time, William Carter didn't know how to respond. There was no deception in her voice, only raw truth. She had carried this burden alone for 5 years. I had no way of finding him. And now, to discover that he was Matthew Carter all along. Her voice trailed off into the heavy atmosphere. William exhaled deeply. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was only thinking of one thing. What happens next? A decision formed in his mind. "I'll take care of this from now on." Emily's eyes widened as she looked up. "Ethan is my grandson," William continued. "He will not grow up without knowing where he belongs." His words weren't just a statement. They were a turning point. From this moment on, Emily Brooks and Ethan Carter's lives would never be the same. Hours later, William summoned his son, Matthew Carter, to his office. Matthew walked in, glancing at his father with curiosity. William, as always, was direct. Without a word, he slid the DNA results across the desk. Matthew picked up the document and read it. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper, but his expression remained calm. William expected a reaction. Shock, denial, maybe even anger. Instead, Matthew simply stared at the page for a long moment before setting it down. "So, I have a son." It wasn't a question. William studied his son's face carefully. "You're not upset?" Matthew let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Should I be?" He leaned back in his chair. "I don't remember what happened 5 years ago, so I can't exactly blame her." His father remained silent. After a brief pause, Matthew exhaled and turned his gaze to the window. "Strangely enough, I don't feel angry. I don't feel like I've been deceived." William folded his hands together. "Then what do you feel?" Matthew hesitated. "I want to meet him." For the first time that day, William's expression softened. "Then go." Now father and son would meet for the first time. Matthew stood outside the cafe, staring at the door. His mind raced. Could I really be a father? But there was no turning back now. When he stepped inside, his eyes immediately landed on Emily and the little boy sitting next to her. And then the boy looked up at him. He looked exactly like him. The same sharp eyes, the same thoughtful expression, even the way he pursed his lips slightly in curiosity. It was all too familiar. Matthew slowly walked over and sat down. Ethan simply watched him. Then, in an innocent voice, he asked, "Who are you?" Matthew smiled for the first time in a long while, and he answered with just one sentence. "I'm your dad." After their first meeting, Matthew started seeing Ethan more often. At first, it was awkward, but Ethan didn't seem to mind. Dad, look, I drew a picture of us. Dad, today at school, I played robots with my friends. Matthew had never heard someone call him Dad before, and strangely, he liked it. He wanted to hear it more. One day, Ethan suddenly asked, Dad, do you like me? Matthew paused for a second. Then he reached out and gently ruffled his son's hair. Of course I do. Ethan grinned widely. At that moment, Matthew realized something. He didn't just have a son. He wanted to be a father. At the same time, William Carter was experiencing something he never had before. He, who once never paid attention to children, now found himself waiting for Ethan's phone calls. During meetings, he would check if his phone was ringing, just in case it was his grandson. And then one day, he did something even he didn't expect. He personally went to pick Ethan up from school. That was when he saw it. A group of kids was teasing his grandson. Your dad's not around, is he? Before Ethan could say anything, William stepped forward, and in a calm yet commanding voice, he said, Ethan has a father, and he has a grandfather too. The teasing kids scattered immediately. Ethan looked up at his grandfather with wide eyes. Then, without a word, he wrapped his little arms around William's leg. Grandpa, thank you. For the first time, William Carter felt warmth deep in his chest. He gently patted Ethan's back. That night, he thought about something he hadn't in years. Maybe this was what family was supposed to feel like. William Carter knew he had changed. Spending time with Ethan had awakened something inside him. And for the first time, he wanted to do something for someone else. Not for business, not for power, but simply out of love. One evening, he saw Ethan drawing at the dining table. What are you working on? Ethan grinned. Our family. William peered over the child's shoulder. The picture had 4 people: Ethan, Emily, Matthew, and himself. His heart ached slightly. He had spent his whole life focused on business, keeping even his own family at a distance. And yet now, a child had placed him in a picture labeled family. Ethan spoke without hesitation. Grandpa, you're our superhero. William didn't say anything. Instead, he lifted Ethan into his arms. For the first time in decades, his eyes stung with emotion. Matthew and Emily had also changed. At first, they were just co-parents, but over time, something between them shifted. One day, Matthew asked, Emily, do you think we could start over? Emily looked at him, startled. He was no longer just the cold businessman she had once met. He was now a father who loved his son, and a man who wanted to protect her. She didn't answer with words. She simply nodded. And Matthew gently took her hand. Their story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Months later, Ethan held his father's and grandfather's hands. Then he looked up at them and smiled. We're really a family now, aren't we? William Carter's voice was softer than anyone had ever heard. Yes, Ethan, we are. At that moment, Matthew and Emily exchanged a knowing glance and smiled. After all the pain, the confusion, the distance, they had finally become a real family.